Nicola. Great. It says it started this side,
Okay.
Leslie. Great stuff.
I will share my screen. Slide. Can you all see that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So this session should last about an hour. Obviously, it will be recorded, so it'll be available for those who can't watch it all. But I'm going to be talking today about plant-powered phytonutrients. Now, this is a huge topic. I regretted actually doing it. No, I didn't. Just because I thought it's so broad and there's so much to learn, and there's still so much that we are still learning about phytonutrients. But hopefully I can give you an overview and a kind of snapshot about what they're about and why they're increasingly important. And then tomorrow, obviously, feel free to chip in throughout. I'm going to cover what they are, where we find them, talk about phytonutrients and health, factors which affect the quality of phytonutrients, and benefits of whole food phytonutrients. So what are they? Well, phytonutrients are basically, the term phytonutrients and phytochemicals are used kind of interchangeably, and they refer to the same thing. They're basically nutrients produced by plants in nature. They're naturally occurring compounds, and they're classed as secondary metabolites. So they're not essential for the growth and reproduction of the plant, but they help the plant to thrive within its environment. They're produced in response to environmental changes. So there's this kind of ecological synergy between the plant, the environment, the ecological system that it lives in, and these metabolites. And in plants, the functions that these phytonutrients include are, for example, they help to attract pollinators. They also help to protect against insects, pests, and environmental stressors such as UV light. And they contribute to the colour, flavour, and aroma of plants. So what are the phytonutrients and how do we classify them? This is where they are just, there is so many of them and it's such a huge number. Basically in plants, over £100,000 have been identified, but I was listening to a researcher recently who said actually there's a kind of AI project going on in California at the moment. And actually they estimate there's around 5 to 10 million phytonutrients in plants. At least 25,000 have been identified in the human dietary plants that we eat. And generally, they're classified by their molecular structure. And I copied this from one of the papers that I was looking at. And you'll see that dietary fibers up on the top right there. And that's kind of classed as a primary metabolite because it contributes to and other carbohydrates and proteins, etc., contribute to the growth and of the plant. But these other phytonutrients, the major sort of subclasses are the polyphenols, of which there are at least 8,000 of them. But you'll see they kind of divide up into various classes based on their molecular structure. But it's a hugely complex subject. How do they differ from other plant nutrients? Well, basically your macronutrients would be your carbohydrates, your fats, your protein, and your micronutrients are your vitamins, minerals, and your trace elements. They are considered essential for survival within plants and humans. But phytonutrients are unfortunately considered non-essential. However, there is increasing evidence, in fact, overwhelming evidence, that they are emerging as essential for long-term health. So although a lack of phytonutrients may not result in immediate illness and death, actually they are very likely a lack of phytonutrients would result in chronic diseases. And this is what the data is telling us. So basically, they contribute to health span, not just lifespan. And if you're seeing it as actually phytonutrients enable us to thrive rather than just survive. And that's what we're all about, not just living longer, but living, being healthier for longer, having healthy aging and being free of chronic diseases and having good mental health, so that hopefully we can still be doing the salsa at 99. Where do we find phytonutrients? Well, in the human diet, they are found in plant foods. So they're found in whole grains, in pulses, beans, peas, lentils, in vegetables, in fruits, in nuts, in seeds, in herbs, spices, tea, and coffee. But actually, the content of the phytonutrients within these foods is highly variable, and that's dependent on multiple factors, but particularly how we process them, because they can be very unstable and they are susceptible to degradation when they are processed, but particularly when they are ultra processed. So when we look at plants as medicine, well, actually, for centuries, plants have been the basis for medicinal remedies, and actually, they're the basis for many Western medicines. An example, willow bark contains salicylic acid, which is the foundation for aspirin, which reduces inflammatory cells. And morphine is made from poppy seeds, derived from poppy seeds, again from plants. Clinical trials often target isolated phytonutrients in supplement form, using specific doses within foods. And that's because of this variability within the foods. But also for bioavailability, so that they can ensure that they're giving, a standardized dose. So there are a number of studies that help support the evidence for phytonutrients. There's a large number of epidemiological studies which look at plant-based dietary patterns. And there's something called the phytochemical index, which these studies will use to kind of measure how many phytonutrient-rich foods are in diets, where they can see correlations with various chronic diseases. The phytochemical index actually does have its downsides. It tends to be based on foods as a proportion of calories from the diet. So actually herbs and spices don't count for much within this index. So there are some downsides to some of these studies. Study indexes, but there is another index which is available, which I do have some notes on the slide if people want to know more, where they do look at phytonutrient contents of herbs and spices included in these studies. But basically, studies have shown that actually higher dietary phytochemical index scores are associated with a lower risk of chronic diseases. There's good evidence supporting reduced risk of obesity and metabolic syndrome, reduced cardiovascular disease and biomarkers, and also reduced hypertension, reduced inflammation and oxidative stress, reduced risk of type 2 diabetes and its complications, and also improved gut health. And then when we look at the evidence, there are also these mechanistic studies which are predominantly done within animals and in vitro lab, so kind of cell culture studies, which help to explain the mechanisms behind. So they kind of these mechanistic studies help to bridge the evidence between the clinical trials and the epidemiological trials to give us these conceptual mechanisms as to how these phytonutrients may be working. So how do they work? Well, they're kind of referred to as the dark matter of nutrition, because actually there's still a lot that we don't know, but there is a lot that we do know, thankfully. There seems to be this really complex synergy with us and our environment. And there are many mechanisms in which they work. And, one being they seem to act as prebiotics, modulating our gut microbiome composition. So they may selectively fuel and promote the growth of beneficial bacteria, They can also inhibit opportunistic pathogens and block them working and their associated metabolites that they produce. But largely, they appear to be transformed. About 90 to 95% of them are transformed by the bacteria that live at the end of our gut, our colonic bacteria, to produce really important metabolites which contribute to lots of various metabolic pathways within our body. There are a number of mechanisms, so they have anti-inflammatory effects, which I'll go into a bit more on the next slide, antioxidant effects, which I'll talk a bit more about in the next slide. They have effects on immunomodulation. I'm just going to move something across. So they interact with cell signal pathways and they help to support a robust and a balanced immune system. They are involved in strengthening our gut barrier, modulating our gut microbiome composition and also the pH of our gut microbiome, reducing inflammation, enhancing tight junction proteins which line our gut barrier and help to keep it regulated. And that affects the permeability of our gut, which has a significant effect on inflammation. They have anti-aging properties by reducing inflammation and cell damage. They also appear to clean up damaged cells. And there's evidence that they protect against telomere attrition, which is basically shortening of our DNA. And this shortening and dysfunction is a key factor in cellular aging. They very increasingly more studied when it comes to cancer, and there appear to be a number of mechanisms in which they contribute towards protecting against cancer, particularly cancer prevention, but also now studies showing that they have a role to play in outcomes to cancer treatments as well. They appear to induce the death of cancer cells. They protect against free radical damage, which I'll touch on in a second. They also inhibit something called angiogenesis, which is basically the established blood supply which cancer cells can develop to help them thrive and increase. So they help reduce that. And they also, via mechanisms, help to reduce the spread of cancer cells outside the local area. They're also involved in altering DNA expression and upregulating or downregulating cell pathways to protect against inflammation and cell damage. They're studied for their effects against diabetes as well. They appear to enhance insulin sensitivity pathways, which contribute to vascular health, and also inhibiting enzymes which block immediate glucose uptake. And they also have a number of functions that are involved in being neuroprotective, so protecting against many of these neurological diseases, an example being Alzheimer's, by reducing chronic inflammation, also supporting cell repair and protecting against age-related cognitive decline. So anti-inflammatory properties, there are a number of ways in which they work, in fact, multiple ways. They appear to inhibit cell signaling pathways. So, for example, curcumin, which is found in turmeric, one of the key sort of phytonutrients found in turmeric, and also resveratrol, which is kind of found in sort of red, darker coloured foods. They appear to block molecules, for example, nuclear factor kappa B, which is basically a molecule which is produced when cells come under stress, and that triggers a cascade of inflammatory cells, and they block that molecule, and they basically act like a brake on the immune system, preventing the immune system from going into overdrive. They appear to, skipped a slide. They also block pro-inflammatory enzymes. So, for example, quercetin found in apples and onions and many other foods, and gingerol found in ginger, appear to block pro-inflammatory enzymes like COX-2 and LOX, which are involved in triggering pro-inflammatory hormones like prostaglandins. So they appear to block that and that reduces pain and swelling. And that's actually very similar to how ibuprofen works. They appear to boost metabolic pathways, which help to produce more anti-inflammatory molecules, and this helps to reduce oxidative stress. And then they're also involved in this gut barrier fortification, which is another way, by supporting that healthy gut barrier, they help to control inflammation. They have antioxidant properties, so whereby free radicals or reactive oxygen species are basically unstable molecules which can cause damage to healthy cells by stealing electrons for them. And the antioxidants appear to work by actually, donating electrons to those unstable molecules, which that diagram depicts there, which helps to stabilize those molecules and prevent them causing damage to cells and developing into rogue cells, for example, like cancer cells. And it's this imbalance within our body of our reduced ability to control this oxidation, which appears to lead to chronic oxidative stress. And that leads to cell damage and also the development of plaques within our arteries, which contribute to coronary heart disease, as an example. And so that's how their antioxidant properties of these phytonutrients appear to work. And they're found in many foods. Your high profile antioxidants are often your vitamins like vitamin C, vitamin E, but often they are found in they're found in a wide range of fruits, vegetables, citrus, pulses, and also dark chocolate as well. So phytonutrients and human health, just to be clear that actually all plants offer a diversity of phytonutrients. They don't just contain one phytonutrient. Often we just study that single phytonutrient because of how complex it is, but they contain a myriad of phytonutrients. And that there is no one superfood. These dietary patterns of having diverse range of foods and more plants and more minimally processed plants in our diet appears to be really important. And it just happens that some of these phytonutrients, for example, turmeric, ginger, and blueberries, are often just more studied, which makes them higher profile. But that balance is really important. And actually, a lot of these foods are just understudied owing to a lack of funding within food research, but also prior research. If the prior research isn't there, then often people don't. It's easier to go down basically the more studied route when it comes to these foods. But what we're learning is that actually our gut microbiome is also really fundamental to how we utilize these phytonutrients. So actually only a small percentage are directly absorbed in our upper GI system, and largely they are transformed by our gut microbes that live at the end of our gut. And us having the bacteria there to be able to transform them into bioactive molecules appears to be really important. So actually establishing a healthy, diverse gut microbiome means that we can then get more from these phytonutrients. And a rainbow of colours can offer us a range of phytonutrients and benefits. So I thought I'd go across the colours because I didn't want to just home in on one phytonutrient. But basically, phytonutrients give, as I mentioned earlier, they give the colour to foods. They also give the aroma to foods, the taste, which is so important for making these foods taste good as well. But red phytonutrients, so there's a few examples there on the right-hand side, but that's just a few examples. There's a spectrum of foods which contain these pigments found in these phytonutrients. But just to give you some example, anthocyanidins, half of them I can't pronounce, by the way, lycopene, quercetin, camphorol, and many more within this category. They've been studied for their properties, including protecting against cancer, protecting against inflammation, protecting against aging, modulating our immune system, and our prostate and vascular health in particular. One of these nutrients, phytonutrients, lycopene, is one of the more studied phytonutrients. It's part of the carotenoid family, or carotenoid family, I should say, and it's found in a range of foods, but particularly concentrated in tomatoes, but also found in watermelon, pink grapefruit. And there are a number of studies that have looked at lycopene intake. So, for example, the Framington study found a kind of heart health, vascular health study, found that an inverse relationship, so higher lycopene intake, was associated with reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, stroke risk, and also mortality. And intakes and other studies support that too. Intakes have also been associated with favourable effects on biomarkers, including lipid profiles and blood pressure too. There have been systematic reviews and meta-analysis looking at lycopene intake and cancers, incidences of cancer, and increased lycopene intake has been associated with reductions in all cancers, about 5 to 10%. And also associations with reductions in prostate, breast, and gastric cancers in particular. Because carotenoids are fat soluble, actually having them with fat helps to enhance the uptake of these phytonutrients. And cooking tomatoes can also increase the bioavailability of the lycopene, which is within these foods. And so, and again, probably because it's breaking down the fiber, meaning that those phytonutrients are more released. And I wonder, our gut microbiome obviously has a significant role with how we break down and digest foods as well. But yeah, cooking can increase bioavailability. Orange phytonutrients, so just a short list on the right, but found in many foods, which give the orange pigment. Alpha carotene, beta carotene, which is a sort of precursor molecule to vitamin A. Beta cryptoxanthin, curcumin, naringenin, and many more. Their studies have shown benefits for eye health, skin health, immune function, reproductive health, and reduced cardiovascular disease risk. I would say don't forget to use the zest of these foods, like orange zest in particular. A lot of the phytonutrients are within the skins of these foods and bound to the skins. And so actually, if we can retain the skins of these foods, then we can maximize our uptake of these phytonutrients, but also flavor. The orange zest in particular has these, amazing aromas and can contribute so much flavor to foods. And often we peel it and throw it away. Just some of the more studied ones. So curcumin, which is a polyphenol found in turmeric. There are a number of studies, including randomized control studies, which have shown improved pain and physical function, markers of inflammation and pain in people who have osteoarthritis. And it seems to act very similar to how medications like ibuprofen work. There's also been studies showing, looking at people with cancer, which showed reduced pain and swelling in people with head and neck cancer, and also joint pain, reduced joint pain in people with breast cancer. The studies looking at cognitive decline, looking at cohort studies. For example, there was a study which looked at community dwelling adults, which were measuring curcumin, their intake of turmeric-rich curry, and they actually saw a reduction in cognitive decline and dementia within these cohorts, suggesting there may be some preventative effects there. And also, it's more increasingly studied within cancer, And there have been studies showing that alongside chemotherapy, it's been associated with improved survival among people living with cancer metastases. But there are some, are some things that we need to be aware of. So I mentioned earlier that a lot of the clinical trials do look at supplement form. And this is where there are there is mixed evidence when it comes to supplement form and, what is the right dose, but I'll talk more about that later. But there are also concerns about high dose supplementation. There is such thing as too much of a good thing. And this is why balance appears to be important. And I'll talk more about whole foods later and the benefits of them. But there is evidence that actually high dose supplementation may actually have negative effects, particularly impacting some of the chemotherapy medications, but also some other concerns. Might be on the next slide actually, which I'll talk about. Fat enhances absorption. So yeah, taking these foods with fat can enhance their absorption. But actually culinary doses, so actually turmeric from food is very much considered safe. It contains about 2 to 9% curcumin, whereas your supplements will be containing 95% curcumin or more, so very much more concentrated doses. So, it's very much supporting intakes of whole food appear to be safe and beneficial, but I'll touch on that later. Yellow phytonutrients, so again, just some examples on the right-hand side. Gingerol, lutein, rutin, xanthin, can't pronounce that, camphor, and many more. Been studied for anti-inflammatory effects, anti-cancer, also their effects on eye health, skin health, and vascular health. One nutrient which has been more studied in particular is ginger, and it's part of the phenolic family. And there are studies supporting antiemetic effects where it appears to block serotonin receptors in the gut and helps to treat nausea. It's also, there have been studies supporting reduced chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting in people with breast cancer. It appears to have anti-inflammatory effects as well, inhibiting enzymes, which similar to the turmeric, which I talked about in reducing pain associated with osteoarthritis, but also chronic low back pain, period pain, and migraine pain. And a lot of these, a lot of the studies kind of start off in animal and cell models, but there are an increasing number of human studies. And the human studies have also shown reductions in inflammatory markers as well with intakes of gingerol, some of the pro-inflammatory markers in particular, like CRP and one of the interleukins. In people with rheumatoid arthritis, so there's associations of reductions in those markers. And the evidence for inflammatory bowel disease is largely animal-based, but it has been associated with reductions in inflammatory markers, but there are kind of mixed results when it comes to the human studies for IBD. But nevertheless, there do appear to be an increasing number of studies supporting benefits for this phytonutrient. Your green phytonutrients, so a lot of the green leafy stuff, giving its colour from these phytonutrients. Some examples include sulforaphane, isothiocyanates, indoles, and epigallocatechin 3-gallate, which is found in green tea, are some of the more common ones. And they're associated with antioxidant effects, having anti-inflammatory properties, anti-cancer, anti-diabetes. We definitely don't eat enough of these foods. As I mentioned in our focusing on more training, less than 16% of adults achieve 5 a day, and that's 9% in children, unfortunately. One of the more studied phytonutrients is sulforaphane, which is part of the isothiocyanate family. It's found in green leafy vegetables, but particularly concentrated in broccoli and also broccoli sprouts. It's been definitely one of the more studied phytonutrients out there. And it appears to be, particularly from whole foods, it requires our gut bacteria to hydrolyze this molecule to produce active sulforaphane from these foods. There are a number of studies showing benefits where it promotes beneficial bacteria and also the GLP-1 metabolite, the appetite regulatory hormones. So, for example, intakes of broccoli seeds in people with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease showed increases in beneficial bacteria, reduction in insulin resistance markers, and increased production of GLP-1. It's been associated with fasting blood glucose reductions. So there was an RCT which demonstrated reductions in fasting blood glucose in people with pre-diabetes, but their response was very much mediated and dependent on their gut microbiota as to, the benefits that they saw. And then anti-cancer properties. So there are studies in animals and cell lab studies, which in particular, which support a role in modulation of tumor-related processes. And there are several mechanisms behind this. And some studies also have shown reduction in cancer biomarkers in humans. But there's very good evidence to support the intakes of vegetables and reduced risk of cancer, particularly bowel cancer, when we look at human studies. And more recently, there's been a lot more studies looking at neuroprotection and particularly looking at autism. And for this reason, because fussy eating and having a narrow dietary preferences is often a hallmark of autism, studies often have involved supplements for that reason. But there have been benefits associated with improved behavior, reduced hyperactivity, improved social interaction and communication, and also a lessening of repetitive behaviors. And there's more studies looking at Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's, which are ongoing, which is really interesting. Blue and purple phytonutrients. So again, just a couple of examples on the right-hand side there. Anthocyanin, resveratrol, and many more studied for their benefits, their antioxidant benefits, anti-inflammatory benefits, protecting against diabetes, supporting brain health, cardiovascular disease protection, and also regulation of weight as well. An example, anthocyanin, which is one of the more studied phytonutrients, gives that dark pigment to foods found in black rice, purple potatoes, berries, and many other foods. But often they're the ones that are studied when we look at the human studies. For example, they've been associated with berries in particular, have been associated with favorable effects on gut microbiome profiles. There've been reduced neuroinflammation and cognitive decline. Studies looking at, for example, black rice intake, which was associated with improved verbal memory and reduction in inflammatory markers in older adults. There's also favorable effects on lipid profiles and metabolic syndrome, which have been studied, and they appear to have beneficial effects on regulating blood glucose levels. And, one of the mechanisms in which anthocyanins may support this is by blocking one of the digestive enzymes, amylase, which can help limit starch digestion, meaning that food isn't so rapidly absorbed and therefore makes its way to the large intestine, feeding beneficial bacteria, which is how it appears to one of the mechanisms in which it contributes to better gut health. And then white and brown phytonutrients. And this is where I want to make the distinction here that actually this is not the typical beige buffet foods that we're talking about. So these are the minimally processed beige and white foods, which look more like real food and contain really important fibers and phytonutrients. So it's not just, they don't all have to, although color contributes, actually there's a range of colors and a broad spectrum, but this group have also appeared to be really, really important. They contain a number of phytonutrients. This is just a few: allicin, lignans, tannins, theobromine. And benefits include anti-cancer properties, anti-aging, improved gut health, improved heart health, and improved hormonal health. One of the more studied nutrients are lignans, which are found highly concentrated in flax seeds, also known as linseeds, but they're also found in other seeds like sesame seeds, sunflower seeds, and in whole grains, your oats, your barley, your wheat, your rye, etc. They're fiber-bound compounds, so they attach themselves to the bran layer, and that appears to contribute to their benefits. And there have been a number of studies looking at lignan intake, and they appear to have a whole host of benefits. One is that they help to modulate hormones. For example, what was I going to say? They have sort of estrogen-like effects. And although, for example, once upon a time, sort of soy was, when it came out in the evidence, that there's always been benefits for soy, but then there were some concerns that actually it might have negative effects. That's kind of been debunked by the evidence, which shows that actually food, lignans from dietary sources appear to help modulate hormone levels. So it's not just because they have estrogen-like effects, they have a role to play in regulating our hormone levels. They've been associated with alleviation of menopausal symptoms. So there was a large women's study which showed a sort of people who had the highest intake of lignans had a significant reduction in all-cause mortality and a significant reduction in breast cancer mortality. And have been associated with benefits in menopausal symptoms. There have been a large number of studies looking at cardiovascular protection, and there's significant evidence that consuming whole grains appears to protect against cardiovascular disease. But also studies supporting reductions in type 2 diabetes prevalence and all-cause mortality. So there's a large number of studies out there supporting the benefits of these foods. So how's quality affected within phytonutrients? I mentioned earlier, these are very unstable molecules, and they're affected by a number of different factors. And soil health appears to be really important. So this biodiversity, where actually these plants work in synergy with bacteria, fungi, earthworms, and also the root systems which connect this ecosystem, all appear to contribute to soil health. There seems to be this kind of nutrient recycling between, the earthworms and the crops, which creates this symbiosis. And there is evidence that actually the less we disturb our soil, the more we use cover crops and organic farming methods enhance diversity of this ecosystem and contribute to soil health, and they do appear to have benefits. However, we really want to stress that, eating more minimally processed plants, whether they are organic or not, will still offer us a range of benefits, a range of fiber, a range of phytonutrients. But just that there is, emerging evidence about soil health and how this does also appear to, enhance the phytonutrient content of the foods that we consume. Heat is another factor which affects phytonutrient quality. Heat can have some favorable effects. So, for example, like I mentioned, the cooking of tomatoes increasing their bioavailability, but it's particularly this high and prolonged heat, exposing foods to very high temperatures and for prolonged times appears to have an increasing degradation of these phytonutrients. Freezing can also negatively impact phytonutrients, but also can enhance some phytonutrients as well and sort of preserve them, I should say. But blanching, which is a process which is done, particularly when foods are frozen, drying, baking and pasteurization can all degrade phytonutrients to some degree. But I think it's thinking about it as if it's a spectrum, and that actually, we've always cooked our food. We've always had a mixture of raw and cooked food. And it's this balance and it's this shift where we've gone from a minimally processed diet to a very, very highly processed diet, which appears to have a significant impact on the quality, phytonutrient quality of the foods that we eat. Steaming, stir frying, reusing your cooking water can also help. It can all help to retain water soluble phytonutrients, which you'll often leach out into the water. And you'll often see, like with those darker coloured foods, you'll see them turn the water a dark colour. And so if you can reuse that water, then you can preserve some of those phytonutrients. Cold pressed oils retain more of their phytonutrients, but also worth remembering that they do degrade faster as well. So, if you've got a nice oil in your cupboard, do use it. Don't let it sit there for years, because actually it is going to degrade, faster than other oils. Another factor which affects phytonutrient quality is light. So exposure to light, particularly UV light in particular, can affect the stability and bioavailability of these foods. So therefore, olive oil is just an example of one that's been more studied, where there's this, degradation in the phytonutrient content. So therefore, buying oils in generally, if they're in opaque containers or tins, as an example, then it would generally be a higher quality product, and that would help preserve it for longer. So if you can, don't keep your oil out on the counter in a clear glass container, because actually that will degrade some of the phytonutrients in it. Storing colourful fruit and vegetables in low light can help to preserve some of the phytonutrients, and actually certain foods like garlic, onions and potatoes and sweet potatoes often prefer darkness, which is why we recommend keeping them in the dark to help preserve their phytonutrient content. There is also some evidence that actually green leafy vegetables may benefit from light-dark cycling, where they appear to have their own circadian rhythms post-harvest, which I thought is quite interesting. I'm not sure how practical that is, though, and I don't think it's anything we have to worry about. But certainly, it was just interesting to read about. Phytonutrient quality, another process, is oxidation from processing. So when we cut, when we mill, when we expose the surfaces of our foods to oxygen, we initiate a cascade of reactions which start, and this results in phytonutrients being lost. But this is a process which becomes increasingly, we increasingly lose these phytonutrients the more we process our foods. So, for example, fats, when they become exposed to oxygen, can become rancid. There are things that we can do to preserve and reduce the browning, and often you'll see when foods are oxidized, that is what results in the browning of those foods. So you might have heard, for example, adding a lemon and lime to fruit salads, or if you do have half an avocado or whatever, covering that in those foods can actually reduce the browning of that food. And if you've got leftover herbs, then actually finally cutting them up and covering them in oil can help to reduce that oxidation, so stopping them wilting, but also preserving their flavor, and meaning that you can keep them for longer in your fridge and use them as a nice kind of dressing. But remembering it's a balance of raw and minimally processed foods. We're not saying that everything has to be completely unprocessed. But I think what's really important to remember is that ultra processed foods, although they might be fortified with the micronutrients, which are often stripped out of them and then added back in, or some of them at the end, they cannot replace the vast array of phytonutrients which are destroyed during their ultra processing. So this appears to be, an area of research which is really interesting, that actually this may be one of the mechanisms why ultra processed foods appear to be so detrimental, where, although they might contain vitamins and minerals, actually the phytonutrients which enable us to thrive and protect us from chronic diseases, they're pretty much, devoid in these ultra processed foods. Another factor which affects quality is storage. So phytonutrients degrade over time, which leads to a loss of that aroma, so the taste of those foods. It leads to a loss of color, flavor, and texture, which is why the longer our fruits and vegetables sit on the shelves, they wilt, they lose their flavor, they lose their texture, and their color. But when we ultra process our foods, you'll find that actually they end up looking nothing like the original food. And because they lose their flavor, their texture, their color, we add in artificial replacements, which are not the same. The evidence is supporting that an increasing intakes of ultra processed foods and these artificial products that are in them appear to have a detrimental effect on our gut health, but also our long-term risk of chronic diseases. If we can, then fresh, local and seasonal, food where available and affordable, yes, that would be the ideal. That does offer benefits, but frozen can offer benefits too. And, within our messaging, we're all about making things accessible, and, frozen, tinned, dried can also offer a range of benefits to people. And remembering to use your senses to detect, how long something's, whether it's past its sell-by date. So, for example, if your herbs and your spices have been sat at the back of your cupboard for a number of years and you've only just got them out, give them a sniff, have a look at their colour. Do they still contain that colour? Do they still smell like the original spice? And if they haven't, then they've probably lost a lot of those phytonutrients, and it would be worth considering replacing them. Another factor which affects our quality, the quality of phytonutrients, is our gut health, which we talk more about in our training. But this loss of diversity and also fiber degrading bacteria appears to impair our ability to process and absorb phytonutrients. So, studies now looking at how these microbes interact with phytonutrients, and more than 70% of the gut microbes that reside within our gut appear to be involved in phytonutrient transformation, biotransformation. So that is metabolizing them into metabolites which are beneficial and usable, which support our health. But by including more minimally processed plant foods, we can benefit from a range of more fibers and more phytonutrients. And just some tips, if we keep the skins on our fruits and vegetables on, the greater the benefit. And also choosing whole grains. And we talk about nudging towards those minimally processed whole grains as well for even greater benefit. But some fantastic sources of different fibers and different phytonutrients. So whole food or pill, which is beneficial? Well, as you probably might guess, the evidence firmly, supports actually having the whole food. So that apple there on the left-hand side has a range of different phytonutrients. In fact, will contain thousands of different phytonutrients, but it's wrapped in this package of indigestible fibers, which help to feed beneficial bacteria as well as other nutrients. but also it will have live microbes, probiotics, living on the outside of the apple and inside the apple, which also appear to contribute to gut health. Whereas that those plant-powered pills on the right-hand side will generally be one isolated or maybe a couple of isolated nutrients. And this is where, you know, this synergy seems to be really important. And actually, whole foods very much outperform isolated supplements. And it's this whole food matrix which appears to contribute to the effects. So within our whole foods, we will have a complete package of nutrients. We'll have that fiber, the macro, the micronutrients, and the phytonutrients working synergistically. And I didn't put water in there as well on that diagram on the right of just all those molecules. Water is really important as well. And you'll notice that actually the more minimally processed our foods, all these nutrients are suspended in a water, solution. And so many of the foods that we eat are dried and devoid of any moisture these days. And also being hydrated appears to be so important too. Isolated phytonutrients in supplement form, as I mentioned earlier, show mixed results. And actually, there are concerns, for example, of high dose supplements in particular. Beta carotene, one of the supplements, has been linked with increased risk of lung cancer and mortality in smokers. And also, they're poorly regulated. And I think that's something to be very mindful of. And yeah, the evidence very much supports having the whole food, and that actually balance is important as well. When we have a balanced diet, things appear to, these nutrients appear to self-regulate and control how much of, certain molecules we produce. And just that the whole food is greater than the sum of its parts, I thought was a nice way to sum that up. So to summarize, aiming for a diverse range of plant foods will help us to obtain a wide range of phytonutrients within our diet, as well as the other nutrients which are within these foods. Including more minimally processed foods helps to retain phytonutrients and fiber and its associated benefits. And if we aim for a rainbow of colours across our diet and more minimally processed, then we're definitely heading in the right direction. That's it. I will.
Great, thank you, Leslie.
I think I've done all right for time there.
Yeah.
Just stop recording a second.
Fantastic.